Excellent.
Hello everyone, this is Carol Dimitrov from OPA Community Outreach, and today we have Donna Young and Tamira McGillivray, and they're going to be talking about understanding house systems. Understanding house systems, which house system is the best? That's a question that many of us ask. How do we use multiple house calculations and still create a delineation that is effective? We're going to be exploring the differences between some of the house systems in use today to help you make informed decisions. And a little bit about Donna. Donna has a consultation and teaching practice in Calgary, Alberta, where she also organizes monthly gatherings for the local astrology community. Donna is also a conference organizer, and Donna can perhaps tell us a little bit about that later on after the presentation. She has a conference coming up for the Canadians and also for the people here in the United States that want to travel to Canada. Donna is also, yes, she has a degree from Kepler College. She's currently an instructor and responsible for the certification program in, in levels 1, 2, and 3 in chart calculation. She is NCGR III certified, trained in the ISAR Ethics and consulting skills, and also the Canadian satellite representative for OPA, which Donna has done a tremendous job for us. So we'd like to thank Donna for that as well. Donna will be the up-and-coming OPA Retreat in Zion National Park in Utah, which we talked about a little bit earlier, so you may want to make sure you sign up for that. It's called The Art of Living and Dying, which she will be teaching a track on hand-drawing the astrology chart. And then a little bit about Tamira McGillivray. She holds a BA in East-West Traditions and Astrology through Kepler College and is the past president of the San Diego chapter of the National Council of Geocosmic Research, NCGR. She writes a weekly Silver Disc Astro Lunar column and is the founder and editor of the Maven newsletter. As a meditation teacher, she's also a Reiki master. She is quantum healing certified and a yoga teacher. Tamira is dedicated to using a variety of methods and energy techniques to meet her clients' individual needs. She's also a member of the board of trustees for Kepler College as well as an instructor. So ladies, thank you so much for coming on today and taking time to work with us on house systems. I know everyone is very interested in this subject, and we certainly appreciate your expertise on this. Thank you. And you can go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thank you for having us, actually, and for everyone that has showed up to join us on this very deep topic. And actually, I think it's kind of secret. Hey, Donna, people don't really talk about house systems, and if they do, there's kind of this, well, what one do you use and why do you use it? And I think that's what kind of started us down this path of looking at them.
Yeah, for sure. It's not like Tamira and I don't profess to be experts on the subject, just to get that out of the way. But we wanted to do this presentation based on our own the questions that we had, because Tamira and I talk a lot, and we teach a lot of classes together. And how do we decide? How are we going to decide which house system to use? And even after many years of practicing astrology, we still have questions. We've chosen, obviously. You have to eventually choose which house system you want to use, but we still have questions. So we figured that probably lots of other people had questions too. Now, we're not going to give you an answer at the end of this, for those of you that were hoping for that. But we hope to give you enough of an explanation that you can yourself make an educated choice.
Yeah, or at least start looking at it. Start looking at, why am I using the house system I'm using, and maybe it is the best one for the astrology that you're practicing. So as you can see on this picture, that there are just 5 different house systems, house calculated systems. And you can see that, in many cases, these little charts actually look very different. So that's what we're going to start, leafing through this and looking at why they're different, how they're different, some of the thoughts behind it. We're not going to get too mathy, so don't worry about that, but it certainly is one of the things to look at. So this is one of my favorite, really, I think it's become a really favorite subject of mine. You know, there's a kaleidoscope of house systems, and that's actually how I see these different house systems, is that, you know, you just make this little tiny shift in the house system you're using. You still have, you know, all of the meat behind it, but it can make such a difference in the delineation, how you're utilizing the information. With over 20 house systems available, you know, I mean, and there's it's not just 20, there's just 20 that we've kind of discovered. 14 house systems to choose from in the average astrological computer program. How do you pick the right one to use? I mean, it's a huge question. And I really do think it's a little bit secret. It's like people don't really want to bring the subject up because they're not sure, you know, the reaction or what other people are going to say about it. So we're going to bring it out into the open. We're going to bring the secret out into the open, and we're going to openly talk about it. And like Donna said, we're not experts in this area, but we're certainly users of house systems. And I think that counts for something. How do we use these, you know, these 14 different house systems to choose from? How do we start to approach that? So here are some of the questions we came up with about house systems. You might have other questions, but these were kind of the basic things that we thought about. What compels you to use one house system over the other? What is it that is, you know, we want you to ask yourselves that question. What is it that, you know, that you have been drawn to a particular house system over the other? Is it because of books that you've read? Is it, you know, what is the reason? Another thing that you have to question when you're looking at house systems is, where do you live? And more importantly, actually, more than about you, is where are the majority of your clients born? Because that's where the house systems actually break down more so, is in extreme latitudes. And being a Canadian astrologer, we do get clients that are from the far north. And this really skews the house, you know, system that you're using. It can skew the houses almost into the point where you can't even use the chart. So what type of astrology are you practicing? Obviously, this has a huge impact on what type of house system you might use, simply because who was it that developed the astrology? What house system did they use? Why? What was the method behind the madness, you know, that they're utilizing this particular system? And then, of course, the biggest question is there a right or wrong answer? I mean, that's the thing, right? Is there any wrong answer to what house system that you utilize? And, of course, Donna and I love to ponder things. In fact, we ponder openly. We bat things back and forth. We argue a little bit here and there. We you know, support each other in our ponderings that we have. And these were some of the things that we came up with to ponder. So, you know, this is one of the biggest tension and separation that we have found between astrologers. Like when you're talking to, you know, the different types of astrologers and the house systems they're using, and it seems that, you know, there might be some argumentation going on about what house systems they're using and which one is the best one. And is this a modern issue? So did they have this, you know, this issue in ancient times? Did the ancients have, you know, did they argue about house systems? I mean, wouldn't that be great to be able to listen in? In ancient times, the popular house system was mainly based on availability. It doesn't mean they didn't argue about them, though, right? I mean, that's a possibility.
Yeah, you can imagine before technology,
yeah.
the calculations of putting together these charts would have been huge. So if you have to go through all of that work every time that you're doing a house system, you're not going to play with all of these different house systems as much as we have the luxury of doing today.
Oh my gosh, no, because, you know, just the math itself. Absolutely. They didn't have that luxury to be able to say, well, what if we did this with the great circles? What if we did that with the great circles? And maybe that's why there is tension and separation between astrologers today, because we have so much choice. I mean, just like in everything in life in modern times, there's so much choice, but you still, you still need to work it through. You need to figure out, what is really going on behind the house system that you're using. And this is, this is what Donna and I are talking about. The time-consuming mathematical calculations are done in minutes. In fact, unless you have taken the course on how to hand draw a chart, which is one of the things that Donna teaches so eloquently, thank goodness she teaches that, then you don't even know what the math is behind the house system, that you're utilizing, probably. I mean, maybe you might have picked a book up and read a little bit about it, but the thing is that computers kind of, at times they make us smarter and other times they kind of dumb us down, because do we really understand what is going on behind the scenes in the computers? But what they allow us to do is they do allow us to compare and look at these different calculations. The difficulty that we come across when we take the same birth time and apply the different house systems is there is this high potential of having conflict regarding where the things happen, because that's what the houses are about. They're giving us the where this is happening, and that's the conflict, and that's where we start to get all kerfuffled. It's like, oh my gosh, is it this, is it that? And of course we don't want to make things fit, we want it to fit, which is, that's a different statement, right? You don't want to make things fit just because someone said it has to. So how do we begin to answer such a big question? And that's how, like, Dawn and I sat down and started to work together on this and started asking some of these questions and looking at what are we going to evaluate and how are we going to evaluate it. It's a huge question because it's worldwide. It's not just about North America. It's about no matter where you are in the world, how are you going to answer this question? Well, my answer is location, location, location. Isn't that the truth about most things? Many house systems fall apart in extreme latitudes, and that's something that you have to look at if you are working with clients or yourself living in those extreme latitudes. So it's important to look at location. Research multiple house systems and evaluate the difference. Of course, the thing about research is you can't just use, 10 charts. Research really entails, casting a wider net. But just in your own practice, taking, a handful of charts and evaluating the differences. Choose the right house system for the type of astrology practiced. I think this is really one of the most important questions in modern astrology that we have to ask ourselves. Are we using the right house system for the astrology practiced? So, and I believe that a savvy astrologer, and I know Donna believes this too, might use several techniques using different house systems for each type based on its ability to what? Of course, to provide consistent and accurate information. That's the goal. I mean, there's nothing else that matters other than, am I getting consistent and accurate information? So it's really important that, well, for Donna and I, it was really important that we keep our mind open, that we didn't get stuck on this house system is better and that house system is better. It's really, does it perform? And I feel in today's society, we need to be open to using more than one house system. I personally do in my own practice. Donna, do you?
I do as well. And I even when I'm practicing with natal charts, even I will look at the chart in a couple of different house systems just to see what changes, because I think that what changes is, and what stays the same, are important parts of the interpretation. If you're looking at a chart in many different house systems and you have one planet that bounces all over the place and another planet that doesn't change at all, I think that's another important consideration. And the other thing that I think we talked about, but we didn't put on this list, but it's very easy for us to also just adopt, you know, what we were taught from our teacher. What house system did our teacher use? And that's valid. Of course, when you're first studying astrology, what else do you have to go on? You're not going to do planet signs, houses, and then house systems. That's not our natural our natural transition. We learn a lot about the technique before we delve into this arena. But at some point, I think even though you can attest to the fact that your teacher did their own research, but you probably want to do your own, because you might have different thoughts or different observations, and you might end up with the exact same conclusion, but at least you've done so with some thought.
Mm-hmm. Or even the fact that now we do have, you know, these really elaborate computer programs that allow us to do these calculations, and maybe our teacher, you know, didn't at that time, or just didn't, you know, it wasn't practiced at that time. So yeah, for sure we want to take advantage of computer systems. And the other thing, of course, we have to ask ourselves is that there, you know, or acknowledge, not ask ourselves, but acknowledge that there are things that do not change, and those things stay constant no matter what house system you use. And of course, you know, this is the meat of the delineation. Degrees of the planets, that's not going to change based on house system. Weight found in element mode and polarity, we could put on there, that doesn't change. Hemisphere distribution, that doesn't change, you know, because we're going to tell you why in a minute. Chart patterns, and we're, you know, we're kind of talking about the basic chart patterns, the Joneses patterns, but of course we know that there's many different chart patterns out there, but none of them change the chart pattern itself based on the house system you use. So there's a lot of common ground here. There's a lot of things that we can use. Dispositor patterns, aspects and angles, none of that changes. So that's why, you know, we found this wonderful picture where the roots are larger than the, you know, than the tree itself, because this is really the root of astrology, are the things that do not change. These are the things that we all have in common, no matter what kind of astrology we're practicing and what kind of house system we're using.
Yeah, and in many ways, I mean, you could look at this and say, maybe this is even enough. I mean, I'm not going to go there in the long story of it, but you can get so much information out of all of this fundamental information that Tamira has listed, that the separation or the division between the different house systems, when you're looking at the intermediate cusps, they're certainly adding. Absolutely, I'm not going to suggest that houses aren't important at all. But look at how much we can get without even going into houses in terms of the chart delineation. So these are all things that we don't have to argue about at all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. And actually that's something that Donna and I love to teach too, is the things that don't change. It's our favorite part of teaching the class that we teach together. So here is, I think, one of the key factors in every house system. This is something that remains the same no matter what house system you use. Just like that above list where we had sort of the meat of the delineation, you know, being the same no matter what. This is also the same. So of course it's the ascendant, the IC, the MC, and the descendant. They do not change no matter what house system you're utilizing. And I think that's pretty cool, actually, that there is this common ground that links us all together no matter what we're doing. And what changes? So if we have all these wonderful things that don't change, what is it that is the big kerfuffle about house systems? Why are we arguing or having tension on what house system we're using? Well, that's because there's some pretty significant things that do change. The houses that the planets land in changes, and we're going to show you some significant, details of that. The house size changes. You can, in northern Canada, you can get all these little tiny slices of houses that you barely can't, you can't even use because they're so, askew. Where the MC and the IC falls in the houses will change based on the different house calculations. Intercepted signs. Some house systems have them, some house systems don't. So what do you do with that? And with the intercepted signs, of course, the repeated signs, because that kind of comes together. So that is really the basis of what is causing our dilemma in picking a house system. So now we're going to start to explore the different types of house systems and how the great circles are used to calculate the house system, because that's what, of course, the divisions are based on. Does the house system provide consistent, accurate information? Of course, that's the whole point, isn't it? That you're picking a house system that gives you consistent, accurate information. Extreme latitudes are going to limit the choice of house systems you have to work with, and what type of astrology you're practicing, and does it have a preferred system? Because one of the things I do believe in is that you should keep the method sort of encompassed in its own self, into its own shell, and not try to take the rules from that and apply them to the rules to that. Just because it works once or twice doesn't mean it's going to work 150 times. So taking the rules and utilizing that within the preferred system, I think, is a really important thing to remember as well.
And what we mean by that, for those of you who haven't looked at different types, is you might use a different house system, for example, for horary astrology. You definitely would use a different house system if you were writing a sun sign column. There would be different times, or if you're doing an electional chart, you might use a different house system for that. So there's a time and a place. We're not talking specifically within a natal chart interpretation that you would use a bunch of different house systems, but for different practices.
Yeah, even Eastern, Vedic astrology versus Western astrology, there are some similarities and some differences in the house placements of the planets. In some cases, they really, they make such a huge change that it's hard to be able to incorporate it. So there are different rules with different house systems, even on the natal chart, but I agree that crossing over into other methods, so you have a client, you're doing their natal chart, and they have a horary question, or you're going to elect a time for something. You have to be able to be savvy enough to be able to switch over and still utilize the rules of what you're using and be able to provide consistent, accurate information, and not be so stuck that you can't put that chart in another house system and be okay with that. I think that that's part of being an astrologer. So now we're going to start going into some of the calculations themselves. Not being mathy. We're not going to be really mathy. We're just going to show you some of the pictures and talk about some of the 3 different main house divisions. And I know Donna is going to work this through for us.
Yeah, well, I'm going to attempt to work it through. And we list here, we say that there's 3 main divisions of house system division, but really when you look at different material, you're going to see some people describe it as 3, some people describe it as 4, and as some of these house systems will end up being in one place in one person's interpretation and a different place in another person's interpretation, because there is some overlap. So, you know, we looked at the information of a lot of different astrologers who lay this out, and in the end, we kind of followed the path of one of our instructors that we had at Kepler College in terms of how we're breaking it down. But just so you understand that, you know, different books will tell you different ways that these are not necessarily how they're calculated, but how we're determining what these divisions are.
Yeah, even how they're described. Hey, Donna, it was like, you know, it was the same house calculation, but they called it a different name or categorized it in a different category, which we were quite surprised at. I didn't realize that until we actually started researching it.
Yeah, so you're going to see different words. You're going to see equal, time, space, quadrant, ancient. I don't know if I've missed any. But within those systems, you're going to see people categorizing them in a different way. Just, you know, and there's logic behind it, but you just need to understand that there's some overlap. So some of them will fall into two of these categories, but we've chosen to follow Bruce Schofield's. And by the way, I want to give him credit. He's given us permission to use the diagrams from his book, Astrological Chart Calculations, in which he actually gives you the instructions for calculating in many different house systems. It's quite a work. So we've followed along with him in that regard. But we're, like we said, we're not really going to get into the math behind all of it, because that's a whole other, that's more than we can cover, but just the general idea. And if we start with, you know, my quick and dirty summary of how these things transpired, is that originally we would have been dividing probably only by dividing the chart by 2, so that we had a day and a nighttime chart. We're just working with the ascendant and the descendant lines. And then, you know, that's really easy. Once we get there, we can just come up with these house systems such as equal or whole, which give a full 30 degrees for each house. Pretty simple calculations. And then when we start adding in the midheaven and the IC line, then we start having the quadrants. And it's when we start having the quadrants that we get a whole bunch of discussion that starts to come forward. The first one, as we could uncover, was Porphyry, who simply divided those quadrants into equal thirds. So, you know, we really suggest that if you ever have to write a chart calculation exam and you get the option of a house system to use, yeah. If they let you do equal or whole, that's easy, but, you know, they might not. But Porphyry is a pretty common one. That's an easy one to use. So choose that one if you get your choice. For sure. Anyway, the book of tables that are provided for the other ones don't make it impossible to calculate, but it's easy. It's just as simple. You can do that one just using your pencil. You don't need the book of tables. But then we have Alcibiades, who decided he wanted to divide the quadrants using a measure of time. And a few hundred years later, Campanus and Regiomontanus decided to improve upon the quadrant method from Porphyry. And then Placidus comes along and he creates this fairly complicated system that he believes is an improvement on the Alcibiades method. And Koch, much farther along, I mean, he died in 1970, so that's a fairly modern one, combines the ideas of Placidus and Alcibiades to create yet another system. And there are many, many other, like Tamira said, you know, there's over 20 house systems. So there's a lot of other astrologers in between who created different house systems, and all, of course, in an effort to try and crack the code, right? What's the perfect house?
Yeah. And you can imagine them all arguing, you know, well, of course, they wouldn't all be in the same room, but, you know, arguing maybe amongst themselves that, oh, this is a better way to do it. Oh, this is a better way to do it. And in their context of maybe culture and location, which, you know, is the huge thing, then maybe it was the perfect house system at the time. But it is, you know, it's where you start to see why that argument is going to start happening.
Yeah. And so what we're talking about when we're looking at this image is what's the ability to separate these quadrants out. We're looking at all of these, we call these great circles, right? How are these great circles being divided up that are going to give us the houses that we so desire to create the perfect chart with?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course there is math behind the madness, and we're not going to downgrade that math. We know how important that math is, and that, you know, drawing a chart by hand, I think, is a really valuable thing to do. It's really valuable to learn because it does, I don't know, almost on a tactile level bring the brain down to the paper, or the stars down to the paper, or something. It does something for us that kind of marries everything up and makes it, I think, make a lot of sense. And I think it helps people to, you know, what if the electricity went out and you had to, you know, could only use your little candle and your books to do a chart.
When the zombie apocalypse comes, what are we going to do?
What are we going to do? I mean, we're going to have to go back to drawing them by hand, for sure. But I'm going for porphyry if that happens, because it's the easiest. So, or whole or something. I'm going to do something simple. But yes, absolutely. So we don't want to downgrade the math. We want you to know how important the math is behind the madness. But we're not going to cover the exact math. That's for the retreat and Donna to work on.
And even then, it'll only be one house system. We're not going to learn them all. So
yeah, for sure.
That would be quite the job. So, you know, one of the earliest ones that we talked about were equal house divisions, which of course includes equal house system and whole house system. So here we're talking about houses that are divided by exact 30-degree segments. So each sign is given 30 degrees that completes the whole circle. And in whole sign, or I'm sorry, in equal house system, then we are starting with the degree of the ascendant, and that forms the first house cusp. And every house after that, every house cusp after that is at exactly the same degree. So that one's pretty easy. The whole sign, based on really the same kind of formula, but in the case of whole sign, the ascendant is a point in the first house, and the first house cusp is formed, begins at 0 degrees of the sign the ascendant falls in. Each subsequent house starts at 0 degrees of the next sign, and it just follows around like that. So again, a pretty easy one to work with. In both equal and whole sign, the midheaven can be found anywhere above the horizon, and that's going to, of course, depend on the latitude. Most commonly, you're going to find it in houses 9, 10, or 11, but as you can see in this chart that we're using as an example, even in house 12. Again, that's somebody that's born at a higher latitude.
And really, one of the reasons why, when we're practicing astrology in higher latitudes, that we have to be really careful about what house system we choose, you know, that we can still get a chart, a map that we can utilize, that we can read and work with the client on. But I think that, yeah, that's very interesting that we find this midheaven, you know, anywhere above the horizon, which gives us, you know, a little added tidbit about the client. But in the whole sign here, yeah, we see this ascendant, you know, found way down here. So those are things you really have to look at for sure.
Yeah, so of course, if you compare this to another house system where the ascendant marks the first house cusp, in just about all other house systems, the ascendant would mark the first house cusp, you can see that, of course, that's going to shift everything. If the ascendant is at a later degree, it's going to shift almost all of the planets. If it's at an earlier degree, you're not going to notice as much of a shift, but these later degree ascendants are going to shift almost all of the planets into a different house. So then it's your job to kind of play with all of those charts, and I would suggest playing with charts that have these kinds of extreme latitudes so that you can really, for yourself, decide which one seems to work better for you.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, equal. We talked about how that worked in the beginning slides, so we don't need to go through that again. But as you can see, the difference between the equal and the whole sign house, it's starting at the degree of the ascendant. The ascendant forms the first house cusp, and the rest of them follow. But the midheaven is still a point in the chart. It's not forming the 10th house cusp as it is in many of the systems. So then we're looking at quadrant-based divisions. That's the one that we decided, well, that's pretty consistent between all of the people who talk about house systems. But when we're talking about quadrants, we're talking about the lines or the areas. You know, we've divided the chart into 4, determined by the ascendant and the midheaven. So it's these intermediate house cusps that are up for question in quadrant-based divisions. How are we dividing by 3 these quadrants between the ascendant and the midheaven and the descendant and the IC, and the IC and the ascendant? So they trisect them using, you know, there's all kinds of ways that people are coming up with how we should divide these up. So we're just going to look at a few of the more common ones. So the porphyry one we talked about as being one of the earliest quadrant systems. And that's a pretty easy one, right? This one is just divided by 3 between the 10th house cusp. Actually, I think you've drawn that in the wrong spot, Tamira. The 10th house cusp is 27.
Sorry about that. There we go.
And a simple division by 3. So, but you can see in this chart, for example, that this is when we start to have more skewing. So this person is born at a higher latitude, and we start to see these really big houses. 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9 are quite big, and consequently 4, 5, 6, and 10, 11, 12 are quite small. We start to see the idea of intercepted houses. So we've got Libra intercepted in this chart, and if you have an intercepted house, then you have a sign that's going to be duplicated. So these are all things that are now going to add to our interpretation. And that's something that you need to buy Chris McCrae's book on interceptions.
Absolutely.
And, you know, that kind of delineation will help you to determine whether this is relevant for this individual. So one of the things that you want to start to look at when you're looking at these quadrant house systems.
Yes, and this is what the easy part of about the porphyry is, that you've got this mirror image across from each other. So as long as you're dividing your one portion, you know, then the other portion is going to be a mirror image.
That's true in all of the quadrant. Yeah, the house system. The houses are opposing each other are always going to be of the same size, so they don't get funny. You only have to actually calculate 6 houses, and then you've got the other ones. Or 4, really, once you've calculated the ascendant and the midheaven. Absolutely. Yeah. So then the next one is Regiomontanus. Now that's a big leap, you know, from porphyry to Regiomontanus in terms of time. So now we're in the 1400s. But he begins at the east point, he's dividing the celestial equator into 12 parts from the prime vertical, and this projection is what forms the house cusps. Again, this one can break down at high latitudes, and it was a fairly popular house system, and one that is very commonly used in horary astrology. Mm-hmm. But because there is a published book of tables, it's one that becomes fairly easily accessible. And that's one of the things that helps to grow many of these house systems is whether there's a book of tables available. So that's another thing that you need to consider, you know, about why was it that these house systems became popular. Which it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing, though. Did it become popular and then they created a book of tables, or did it become more popular because there was a book of tables?
Yeah, for sure. And even in the computer programs, what is the default? So when you like boot up your computer and, you know, there's the default there, is that the reason why that computer, that particular house system was so popular?
Or continues to grow in popularity. And we're not saying that, we're not saying that's the case. It's just something that we want you to question. Okay, and then we have Campanus that comes next. And well, I suppose actually he came before. We probably have these out of order. But regardless, it's a similar kind of an idea in terms of how these great circles are divided, how they're trisected on the prime vertical. So in this case, the lines are projected on the ecliptic. The prime vertical is divided into 12 equal parts. And again, it breaks down at high latitudes.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's quite a few local space folk that actually use this particular house system. And that's kind of when it became popular again in the 20th century. And wasn't this the one that Dane Rudar used as well, I believe?
I think that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Rudar used this house system.
And that's actually something that we also, it's not just about what tables were produced, but when someone is writing a book and this is the system that they use, then, you know, everyone's going to be madly looking up, you know, that house system and putting, you know, their charts into that house system based on, you know, their love of the material of the author of the book. So that's another factor that we look at when we choose a house system, would be, you know, who's writing what book, not just the tables.
Yeah, and is it, you know, how foundational and is it for Rudar, you know, in terms of his book on person-centered or his idea of person-centered astrology, it was very important for him. Mm-hmm. So again, you know, do you follow Rudar? Maybe that's the one for you.
Yeah.
And then we go into time-based division. Now, when we're talking about time-based, we're talking about how long it takes for the sun to travel, really. And so how are they going to be dividing these up? And some of these time-based systems can become quite complicated. So, yeah, we'll just talk about this just, you know, very briefly, of course. I think these are some of the most complicated ones to calculate. Alcibiades is probably the oldest house system. It's named after an Arabic astrologer, but he did not invent it. So it was very popular in the Middle Ages, and they believe originated in Roman times. So in this system, it trisects the diurnal and nocturnal semi-arcs of the ascendant in terms of time. Right? So so we're talking about Porphyry, where it was using space or distance. This one is trisecting the amount of sidereal time needed for the degree of the ascendant to rotate to the midheaven. So really we're talking about, you know, planetary hours here. So we're rotating that, and then from the IC to the ascendant to the IC to generate the second and third houses and so on. So it's, again, a little bit more complicated. And then the next one is Placidus. Now Placidus is probably the most well-used house system that people are using today. And this is the one that is definitely the default for Astro.com, and, you know, I think, I haven't been to all of them, but I suspect most of the online chart generating programs that you can find.
Mm-hmm.
But this is one, of course, too, because it's been around since the 17th century. But they believe, or it was named after the guy who was born in the 17th century, but they believe that it was developed much, much earlier, probably in the 13th century. But there was a book of tables for it as well, and continues to be a book of tables for it. So a little bit easier for people to study that one. This one is a very complicated chart calculation system in terms of the trigonometry behind it. But basically, you're looking at the house cups are being formed. They're found on the ecliptic by locating the diurnal circles that intercept the ecliptic at 1/3 and 2/3 of the distance from the meridian to the horizon. So it does not do well in extreme latitudes, but it performs better than some of the other ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think that's true of all house systems, really. There are no house systems that perform really well at extreme latitudes, especially if you're talking about on the solstices. When, if you could imagine yourself in, you know, at the extreme North Pole, or where they have, where the sun never sets, where that sun is traveling all the way around the horizon, even a whole sign house system is going to break down, because your ascendant and your midheaven are not going to be defined by dawn or sunset.
The only saving grace, I think, with the whole sign system or the equal in those extreme latitudes would just be working with the houses themselves. It's just a little easier to be able to see you know, what's going on. In extreme latitude, you've got these like multi-lines where you can't even, you know, hardly tell what is on the house cusp. So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And now you can always say, of course, there's a moment when if you're watching the sun travel around the Earth, there's a moment when it's at the extreme ends of it, so you can base it on that. But anyway, so the next one is Koch, and this actually a fairly modern house system, relatively speaking. He was around from 1895 to 1970, so you know it's fairly new, relatively speaking. And he combines the theories of Regiomontanus and Placidus to arrive at a completely different set of calculations for house cusps. So again, one that's probably a little more complicated, but certainly worth, and it's quite a popular one. It's, you know, today, and especially in Europe, I believe it's quite popular. So another one that you might want to consider. And then we've got a few other house systems that when we look at how people are labeling them, they're a little bit harder to define. They seem to end up all over the place. But these two, Marinus and Meridian, are some of the two more popular of the other house systems. Marinus, he was computing houses by dividing the equator into equal parts, which is similar to Regiomontanus, but then they are projected through the pole of the ecliptic, not the pole of the equator. So,
and that ascendant lands, you know, in weird spots in his charts. So it kind of throws you for a loop.
Yeah. So in this one, it's anchored by the midheaven.
Yeah.
And the first house is 90 degrees away from the midheaven. So that's kind of an interesting one to look at, because I think it's the only one, well, no, these two, the ascendant can land anywhere, because they're anchored by the MC.
Yep.
And the meridian house system and the Marinus system, these two are actually apparently quite popular with the Hamburg School of Astrology. So it's Uranian astrology that uses these two systems. So kind of interesting to look at. Whether you get into that type of astrology or not, certainly worth exploring. So we wanted to bring up this, you know, we did this little grid of this person's chart. And so you can see the big differences between some of these house systems where some of the planets land, especially because we're talking about somebody whose MC landed in the 12th house. So you can see that there are at least 3 differences between where these planets will land. In the case of Mars, actually even 4. Mars can be in the houses 8, 9, 10, or 11.
Yeah.
Most of the other are really only divided by, we've got 3 different choices, but still 3 choices is a lot of choices. We see the ones that are on the angles, the sun and the moon, they're pretty consistent. The only one that changes in these examples is whole sign shifts from 7 to 8. But because they're an angular house position, they're pretty consistent across all of the other house systems. So here's where we get to start looking at how do we make these choices. Now the intercepted houses, of course, are one of the things that we want to consider. Different house systems, even though they look on the surface like they might be quite similar, we've got different houses that are intercepted, different signs that are intercepted. And of course, if we have any planets in those signs, that's going to be even more telling for us. And in the case of Campanus, we actually even have a triplicated signs here. So we're going to bring up these charts again and maybe talk through some of these ideas. So just in case, for those of you, some of you might have recognized this chart, but this is actually the chart of Prince William. And yeah, he's born in London. It's pretty high. They're pretty far north, so we get this nice example of a skewed chart. So think about these differences. Now, without knowing which house system is which, now some of them might be obvious to you. Maybe we can just talk through this a little bit. Which one which one is one that seems to make the most sense? And again, we don't have an answer.
Yeah, but when the thing is that when you have a client and you have these wildly different house placements of planets, the thing is not making it fit. It's got to fit naturally. You can't, we can make a argument for almost any, especially astrologers. We can make an argument for anything to fit anywhere, but it needs to fit there naturally. And this is where, Donna talking about the planets that shift are the ones that you need to keep your eye on, and even more so like that deal where, you've got lots of planets in something and then you've got no planets in something. The no planets is just as important as the one that's got a bunch of planets in it. So, if that planet is not shifting and it's staying stationary in the house, no matter what house system you're using, I think that it's something you really need to keep your eye on as well. So that's sort of where we were starting when we were looking at some of these ideas. We've come across some incredible examples of this situation where this one planet, even in one case, we found a chart where the sun shifted 3 houses. I mean, that's a pretty significant idea. So, being able to really make the astrology work, not making it fit. That's, I think, where we're trying to approach the delineation portion of the house system that you pick. So, starting with something like the whole sign system, and it's the one that I think has the most shift in it, wouldn't you say, Donna, that going from whole sign to, any other house system, it usually has some sort of shift.
Yeah, for sure. Well, depending. I mean, in this case, because the ascendant is at such a late degree, it's a significant shift. If the ascendant, the natural ascendant is at 1 or 2 degrees, you might not notice it so much. I mean, that's going to be the thing that makes the big difference, and something that you consider.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and so, you know, let's look at this chart. We've got the future King of England here. Now we can see that in all of these charts, the things that we talked about that are the same. You know, we still have 27-degree Sagittarius ascendant, and we still have a 2-degree Virgo midheaven. So none of that is going to change. But what house makes more sense? And again, we don't have the answers here, but you know, if we think about this, if we want to do our delineation, if we're talking about a difference between a 7th or an 8th, or this one up on the right-hand corner, that's kind of an oddball chart that we have up there. I can't even remember what that one is.
This one?
But we've actually, no, the one in the upper right-hand corner.
This one over here. Oh, this is more. This is Mornis.
Okay, there you go.
Where the ascendant can land anywhere in the upper quadrant there. Yeah, very odd.
And you can see that the sun is in the 5th house in that chart.
Yeah, and you've got that Jupiter midheaven right at the top of the chart.
Yeah.
So, and also the other thing that I think is really interesting in these shifts, almost even more than the planetary shifts that happen, are those intercepted signs where you're getting this huge difference in interceptions and how you actually apply that to you know, to someone's life, and how, because when we were going through it and we were delineating it on the fly, you could see a story for both, you know, both sets, both types of delineations, and perhaps that's the fluidness of astrology, is that depending on what you are seeing of the person and the life direction they've taken based on the culture that they're in and the environment that they're in, you know, that the fluidness of these house systems allow you to, you know, to work with that. I don't know.
Carol, how much time do we have?
I think we're almost coming to an end.
We can go a little longer if you'd like. That's not a problem, depending on how you feel with your time.
Well, I think what we wanted to do is kind of open up for questions and for thoughts about these charts. So, and especially because we have Chris with us here, I'd love to hear her take on the interceptions in these houses. But any other questions that anybody might have, or thoughts on how we might delineate these charts, which ones look like they might fit better?
Perfect.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do is, for anyone that has a question, if you would just put a question mark or just hit any key in the chat box, your name will come up and I can unmute you. If you'd like to actually ask a question or have me ask the question for you, you can type it in the chat box. We can do it that way. Otherwise, if we open up all the mics, we won't be able to hear a thing. And then I would love to open up Chris McRae's mic, if that's okay.
And talk about some intersections. Yeah,
we're taking advantage of the fact that you're here.
We are, yes.
Let's see, I think Chris is maybe self-muted. Chris, if you can hear me, can you unmute yourself? We'll see if Chris can unmute herself. She's actually muted herself, so.
Sure.
So we might not be able to get some of her great insight, which was...
we do have a question from Sue Minahan while we're waiting for Chris. Sue Minahan says, why does Uranian astrology use the Uranus or meridian?
Well, I'm guessing, I mean, I'm not an Iranian astrologer, but I am guessing it's because of the fluidity of that ascendant. I mean, it would only, that would be the only thing I would think would really make it, you know, an interesting thing for Uranian astrologers. Donna, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't really say I know the answer. Again, I do not study Uranian astrology either. But because there's so much of a connection to the midheaven, I'm wondering if that might be part of the reason behind it.
Yeah, the fluidity of the ascendant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's something maybe that Sue can explore a little bit further. And it looks like we have Chris on. Chris, can you hear us?
What is the question being asked of me?
Sorry to put you on the spot, Chris. If you could shift back to those other houses, Tamara. We wondered, because we're looking at Prince William's chart, because you're the expert on intercepted signs, what you would have to say about the intercepted signs in his chart. If you were, how would that add to the interpretation?
Well, first of all, I don't know which house customs these are, and secondly, I can't evaluate these intercepted houses in each one of these that quickly. That would be expecting a bit much.
No, yeah, of course not. Just in general, interceptions, how they add to the chart interpretation.
Well, of course, just as you said, the different house systems are going to get different sets of interceptions. Prior to doing that interception book, I did a great deal of research on house systems myself. And two of the things that I devised in my thinking was that, first of all, I didn't see the reason for using the oldest system that existed when many different mathematicians had attempted to find better ways of setting up the chart structure. So that was maybe feeble thinking, but that was one of my thoughts. The other thing I did was I did many different charts in the different house systems at this latitude. As you ladies have so aptly pointed out, the latitude that we're living at certainly does make a big difference. So what I had done is I had done a large number of charts in different house systems to see which ones at this particular latitude. Edmonton is 53 north 32. London is, I believe, 51 north 31 or something like that, the charts of Prince Charles. But anyway, in my working with all of those different charts and looking at the different meanings, I concluded that at this latitude, the Placidus was working better. I have another argument too about horary astrology, or a thought to project, in that in horary astrology, many astrologers will do the Regiomontanus because that's what William Lilly used. To me, that wasn't a very good reason, simply because the Placidus house system came after William Lilly, and he wasn't even aware of it, so he would not have been able to evaluate it in terms of horary. So it is a very big question, ladies, and you've covered so many different points, and those are the things that I would simply add. So thank you for that little moment.
Yeah, good. Thank you for sharing, Chris. Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. We're asking people to look at a type of astrology that, their teacher was using that didn't, before the house system existed. Very good point. Another thing to add to what you think about when you're going through these choices.
Yeah. And as you say, there are different house systems do break down faster as you start going north. And I noticed that about coke. You don't have to go very far, very little further north than where I am, and coke really does begin to break down quite severely, which is the reason why I would not use coke. So we have our particular reasons, don't we?
Yeah.
Yep, for sure. And so I guess all we're asking for you through the course of all of this is to know what your reasons are. So to not just blindly follow, once you get past a certain point in your education, of course, like I said earlier, to follow your teacher is fine until you get to the point where you can do your own research with some thought and with understanding how they work, to make an educated decision on which house system is going to work for you.
And when you get to the more middle range latitudes, it doesn't make nearly as much difference in which house cusp system you use, does it?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I agree. And so then, you know, you're not really going to care if you have a lot of clients coming from that area.
Right.
It's the only thing that I think, you know, you really look at in those middle ranges is what's on the house cusp in the intermediate houses, 2, 3, you know, 5, 6, those house, what is on the cusp if you're doing transits is going to, you know, as you shift through, you know, Jupiter going, when does Jupiter hit the second house? You know, when does Saturn hit the second house? Those things are questions people want to know. So I feel that you doing your research and you determining what house system is working on the type of astrology you're doing, whether it's transits or solar returns, for instance. I do a lot of solar return work. It's going to make a difference when you know, you need to look at it, and is it consistently giving you data feedback on when those house cusps become active? Because, you know, yeah, the planets shift a little bit, and you know, when you're in the middle of the country, they barely shift at all. But those house cusps are going to be different, and I think that's going to make a difference in your transit work and your progression work. I feel anyways that it would be something to look at.
It's very interesting. Chris, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate that, Chris, and giving us your insight.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. But, you know, it is a very important subject for me, and one that I have thought about over so many years. So I appreciated hearing about what other people had to say about it.
Yes,
Thanks,
yes. And Chris, just to give Chris a little bit of it, to give you a little bit more of information about Chris, she is actually going to be at the Zion Retreat, and her topic is going to be horary in 3 parts. So make sure that you stop by and say hello to Chris. If you haven't already signed up for the Zion Retreat, you might want to check and see if Chris has a space available. And Chris, I look forward to seeing you in Zion.
Yes, and I look forward to seeing all of you and everybody, and I look forward to being at Zion. It is such a magnificent place. I've been there many times, and I am in total awe every time I enter it. It is so spiritual. It is so alive. It is so magnificent. I can't even find words to describe it.
Yes.
That in itself is a good reason to go, outside of the fact of all of the great people that will be there.
Yes, well, we look forward to seeing you there, Chris, and thank you again for coming on last minute like this. We do appreciate it.
Well, yeah, taking advantage of the presence of somebody who's been practicing for many, many years. That's awesome.
Yes, yes.
I noticed a few questions here.
Yes, we have one from Courtney, and Courtney says, will you tell us which house system are used in the bottom 2 charts? Also, will you disclose which house systems you use and when you switch house systems, please? Thank you. Interesting topic.
For house systems, I use whole sign, and I use Regiomontanus.
And I use Coke, and I use whole sign, and I use Placidus because I like to see where everything changes. So I do shift around, and anybody who's studied with me will attest to the fact that I'll even do it in the middle of a class. I'll look at it one way and then, you know, pull up a chart, not necessarily on purpose, but because I'm looking at them in different house systems all the time. You never know what you're going to get when I pull up a chart. But when I do a reading for someone, I do like to look at a few of them to see what is consistent and what isn't.
Yes, and for my Regiomontanus, it's because of solar returns that I use Regio most of the time. But I mean, I'll confess I do look at Placidus often. But you know, 9 times out of 10, or maybe 9.8 times out of 10, there isn't a difference in the charts between Regio and Placidus. And whole sign is, it's something I love looking at, and I love to see what shifts between a whole sign chart and you know, one of the quadrant systems. I love to see that shift and to see if that's actually playing out in someone's life. So I enjoy looking at different, coming from, you know, from different points of view, but being able to tell the same story, actually. I like doing that.
Thank you.
I think that this ties into Alex's question too. Do you have a certain house system that always works for you? And I would have to say no. And that's the reason that I look at a chart in a few different house systems.
Yes, although I think that whole sign doesn't work in transits. I think that not when you're looking at house transits. Obviously, it works with planetary transits because that doesn't change. But there are some systems that do work better with depending on the type of astrology that you're working with. And I don't know. I haven't done enough study to see if whole sign works with solar returns because I haven't really played around with solar returns in whole. So I think that the system can break down in particular, you know, house systems that you use, and you have to be really careful about that. It's like, you know, when you get these new, you know, we have some new dwarfs in the sky. I like to look at it. It doesn't mean I use it, right?
Yes.
I'll look at it and I'll see what is the difference. What does that add to the delineation? Does it add anything to the delineation? But it doesn't mean that I use it when I'm actually doing practical work with a client.
Yeah. And Joanna has a question here about which house systems are you required to know for certification.
Yes.
And really, I mean, when you write a certification exam, they're going to tell you, you'll have a book of tables that you'll use. You don't need to know all of the math behind every, you know, these house systems from scratch. You'll be given a book of tables. So the understanding of how they work is important, but you don't have to do all of the calculations that the ancients did because you will be given enough information that you can work your way through. But I think I'm going to guess, and again, maybe Chris knows more about this, but I'm going to guess Placidus would be
I think it is Placidus.
I know when we wrote our exams at Kepler,
it was Placidus.
We got to choose between a couple of them, but we still had to have the book of tables. Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was, I must have chosen Placidus because that's all I remember. Placidus, yeah.
But I haven't written the exams for all of the certifications, so I can't speak to specific certifications. But generally, you know, you'll be told which book of tables to get or provided with a book of tables, and that will be your clue. But there'll be more common ones for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, ladies. Donna, I would be remiss if I did not give you a few moments to mention your conference that you've been working so hard on. Would you like to say a few words about that?
I would like to clarify that it's not my conference specifically. But it's in cooperation, really, the Edmonton Astrology Group and the EAS that Chris founded, and the group of astrologers in Calgary. We come together to do this conference. This national one is every couple of years. We're only in our second year of bringing it back to life. And it's in Calgary this year, and that's September 15th to 17th. And we're featuring astrologers, Canadian astrologers from across the country, from coast to coast. And Chris, in fact, will be speaking at this conference for any of you who haven't had the pleasure of seeing her present. And we're really excited about it because there isn't another astrology conference in Canada, at least that I'm aware of. And so certainly it's open to all Canadians, but for those of you that are in the U.S., you know, your dollar is doing pretty good compared to ours, so it might be the most affordable conference you'll go to.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's a very good point.
Yeah, it's just a small conference, but we hope it's going to be, you know, quite intimate and lots of fun. So we hope that many of you can join us. And that, I'll type it in the box, but the website is just astrologyconference.ca.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, ladies, for this interesting and informative presentation. I know that we are all thinking about the different house systems now, and we'll also be getting on our computers and maybe playing with them and taking a look at which ones that we feel more comfortable with and seeing the differences, and just a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I really hope that you will play with these a little bit more. I hope it's piqued your curiosity.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. And everyone,
Okay.
the recordings will be with you later today. So I thank you, everyone. And we have a lot of thank yous and a lot of great messages. And also, let's see, Devin says thank you, very informative. A lot of great feedback here. Elizabeth, another excellent informative webinar. Thank you, everyone, from Carolyn. Thanks, ladies, from Tracy, Kimberly. Everyone says their thanks. And we'll see you for the next presentation.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Has your recording stopped?